We've been journeying through the book of Acts for over 5 months now. Some weeks studying a whole chapter, on other times we've managed just a few verses. Well, today I'm going to do something quite radical. I'm going to move at pace through not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 chapters. For a short while we're going to get a brief overview of what happened to Paul. For unless we can understand the narrative, it's not really going to make a huge amount of sense to us. Then, based on the story, we're going to ask a really important and searching question. I'm not going to tell you what the question is, but my guess is after listening to the narrative, you will have that same question. Okay, here's the overview. Hold on to your hats, lots to take in, and I do encourage you to read chapters 23 through to 26 for yourselves. Paul the Apostle was commissioned by God to take the good news of Jesus to the world outside Israel, and that he did faithfully, going on 3 long missionary journeys through Syria, Turkey, Macedonia and Greece. And as I said last week, he seemed to cause a riot wherever he went. We concluded last week's study with Paul getting arrested in Jerusalem on some trumped up charges, at which point, quite surprisingly, he was allowed by the Roman commander to speak to the frenzied crowd who wanted to bring his life to an end. At first, they listened to what he had to say because he spoke in Aramaic, their own mother tongue. He identified with them by saying that he too had been a zealous follower of the Jewish religion, and that he had previously persecuted followers of the way, that is Christians, until he met with the risen Jesus on the way to the city of Damascus. There was a bright light from heaven that blinded him, and a voice that asked him why he was persecuting Christians. Paul then told of how God commissioned him to tell the good news of Messiah Jesus to the Gentiles, at which point the crowd went crazy. If they were frenzied before, they were utterly hysterical now. The Gentiles, or non-Jews, were despised by them. In their morning prayers, Jewish men would thank God that he had not made them slaves or Gentiles. They also thanked God that he had not made them women, but that's another story. The Roman commander who had let Paul speak to the crowd wasn't too chuffed with Paul for winding up the crowd yet again, and ordered that he be flogged. Really nasty. The whips that were used for flogging contained pieces of broken glass and metal that would tear a victim's back to shreds, and it wasn't unusual for a person to die or to go mad during the punishment. Roman justice was often punish first and ask questions later. However, Paul did have a trump card in his back pocket. He was a Roman citizen, and Roman citizens had a number of rights, including not being flogged before they were tried. Close call. The Roman commander released Paul the next day and ordered the chief priests and his accusers to meet with the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the highest Jewish court in the land. The commander wanted to offload this religious matter to the Jewish court. Let them deal with it. But as we read on, we discover this was not the wisest move. Paul, typical Paul, led his own defense and took the initiative in the court. My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day, said Paul. Well, no one had actually asked Paul to speak. The high priest didn't like this very much and asked the guy next to Paul to smack Paul in the mouth. Nice. Paul responded with, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Charming. But in his defense, he only used words similar to Jesus when Jesus called some of the religious leaders whitewashed tombs. Paul then needed to apologize because the guy was the high priest, and by all accounts you shouldn't speak to the high priest in that way, even if he deserved it. Paul knew that this court was made up of both Pharisees and Sadducees. Pharisees and Sadducees were very different. The Pharisees believed in the supernatural, angels, demons. They also believed in the resurrection. But Sadducees didn't believe any of those things. So, Paul used an old tactic. You might have heard of it before. It's called divide and conquer, and suggested that the conflict was due to Paul believing in the resurrection, which brought immediate support from all the Pharisees, who stoutly defended him, while all the Sadducees wanted to string him up. There was a violent dispute, and members of the court became even more frenzied than the crowd outside. Yet again, Paul is dragged off to the barracks. Now this sounds more than a little scary. However, we do read in chapter 23, verse 11, "The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, 'Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome.'" Now I'm sure that that would have brought Paul great comfort, that he was still on the right path, that God was with him. The next thing that we are told was that there was a conspiracy to kill Paul. 40 men took an oath to kill Paul before they would eat again. Now, we do know that Paul lived for several more years, so I can only guess what happened to them, whether they kept their vow or wriggled out of it somehow. But that aside, Paul's nephew heard that there was a plot to kill Uncle Paul. So he told Paul, and Paul asked him to go and tell the commander, which he did. The result was that the commander ordered 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen to take Paul to Caesarea to the governor, a weasel of a man named Felix. How about that? 470 elite Roman soldiers guarding one man from a few Jews. Overkill, perhaps. But then again, Jesus did say that he wanted Paul to testify about him in Rome, so maybe Jesus was just making sure that Paul would get there safely. The next thing that happens is that Ananias, the high priest, and his crew travel to Caesarea to bring up trumped up charges against Paul. They were represented by a lawyer who used words like troublemaker, ringleader when he described Paul. Paul again defended himself, denying that he was guilty of any of the charges, and that he came to Jerusalem to bring a gift to the poor people of the city, which of course was absolutely true. 2 years went by. Paul was left in prison, and Luke tells us that the reason for this was that Governor Felix wanted to be in the good books of the Jews and chose not to release him as a favour to them. Well, moving on. Governor Felix was replaced by Governor Festus. Felix left Festus with a 2-year-old problem, a problem called Paul. The court was reconvened. Charges were once again brought against Paul. Paul spoke in his own defence. The Jews wanted to take the trial back to Jerusalem so they could ambush him and kill him on the way. Festus, just like his predecessor Felix, wanted to keep on the right side of these troublesome Jews, so asked Paul if he would go back to Jerusalem. Well, at that point Paul knew that he wasn't going to get a fair trial, so he pulled out another trump card. He appealed to Caesar, which was another right that he had as a Roman citizen. And at that point, no further discussion was required. You appeal to Caesar, and to Caesar you will go. Well, Festus was well out of his depth. He now needed to write to Emperor Nero to explain the case, but in truth he had very little idea of what was going on. But help was not far away, or so he thought. There was soon to be a state visit from none other than King Agrippa II. King Herod Agrippa II, to give him his full title, was from a dynasty of ruthless and morally corrupt men. His great-grandfather was Herod the Great, who tried to destroy baby Jesus and then ordered the infants to be slaughtered in Bethlehem. Herod's son and Agrippa's II grandfather, a man called Herod Antipas, beheaded John the Baptist. He was the Herod that Jesus called the fox. Agrippa's father was Herod Agrippa I, and he murdered the Apostle James, the brother of John. And Paul is now before Herod Agrippa II, who was himself involved in an incestuous relationship with his sister, Bernice. Nice family. Not. Bernice had already been the wife of her uncle and later became the mistress of the Roman Emperor Titus, who was responsible for destroying Jerusalem. The royal visit was a great opportunity for Governor Festus, because he was able to say to King Agrippa, "You know all about these Jews and their Jewish religion. What shall I do with this man Paul? He has an argument with his fellow Jews about someone else called Jesus. They say that Jesus is dead, but Paul says that he's alive. I can't make head or tail of it, but I need to get this file off my desk. And even worse than that, I have to write to Emperor Nero about this case. So, help." Well, Agrippa couldn't refuse, as the case was about the man that his great-grandfather tried to kill, and the man that his grandfather questioned before his crucifixion, and the man that his father often talked about, as his followers were such a pain. Paul was brought before King Agrippa and was invited to tell his story, a variation on the story that he had told them told the frenzied crowd in Jerusalem that we looked at last week. I'm not sure that Paul was aware of what Jesus had said some years before, but Jesus on an occasion said that on my account you will be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. But when they arrest you, do not worry what to say or how to say it. At that time you will be given what to say. Now, some years later, Paul found himself before governors and kings, and he doesn't seem to even be slightly bothered about knowing what to say. The Spirit gave him words in abundance. Paul, this little Jewish tent maker, gives his testimony before governors and kings. Well, Festus interrupts him and says, "You're out of your mind, Paul. Your great learning is driving you insane." The Greek word for insane is the word mania. In other words, he was saying, "Paul, you're a religious maniac." There's a comment that I've heard once or twice, I think, probably in my lifetime, or maybe more than that actually. Especially when someone embraces the Christian faith. Those who knew that person can't quite get their heads around the changes in the person. It seems as though they are driven by new passions, and very often they receive that comment, "You're a religious maniac." Well, Paul is full of confidence. He then challenges Festus and King Agrippa over the reasonableness of his views. Paul might not be someone that you would want to go out and have a beer with, but I'm sure that you admire his passion and his courage. I certainly do. He had a real passion for souls. Well, I said earlier that the story over these few chapters caused me to ask an important question. And you might even have the same question as me. And my question is, why did God allow Paul to go through all these years of inactivity? During the governorship of Felix alone, he spent 2 years in a cell when there was so much work to be done. After all those thousands of miles travelled throughout the Roman Empire, after all that time, Paul is now caged. His wings are clipped. His ministry is sabotaged. His effectiveness is disabled. Why, God? It doesn't seem to make sense. Surely this was not the best use of Paul's time and gifts. He was an apostle to the non-Jews, a missionary, a church planter. What a waste. Well, let me ask another question. Did Paul think that way? Did he consider this time a waste? Well, I don't believe that he did. Following this time in Caesarea, Paul went to Rome for his case to be heard by Emperor Nero. Another 2 years under house arrest before his trial was heard, during which time he wrote 4 letters. In his letter to the Christians at Philippi, he, I think, answered this question of whether he saw these years of trials and arrest and incarceration a waste or not. This is what he says or writes. Philippians chapter 1 verse 12. Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. And as we read through Acts chapters 21 through to chapter 28, we are given a whole catalogue of events that occurred in Paul's life shortly before he wrote this letter to the Philippian church. Think of today's narrative. Paul was falsely accused by his own people, nearly lynched by a religious mob, ended up in a Roman cell, escaped a flogging by pleading that he was a Roman citizen. His whole case was a mockery of justice. He was insulted. He was ridiculed. There was a deadly plot against him. He was left in a cell for 2 years because of political expediency. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to discover that he was caught up in a storm at sea, resulting in a shipwreck, leaving him at the mercy of the open seas. Eventually he reached Rome, chained. He then waited 2 years for the decision of whether he would live or die whilst under house arrest. Sorry, I should have given you a spoiler alert there. Verse 12. What has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel, says Paul. Even in those words, Paul reveals what sort of a man he is. His heart, his focus, and his passion is centered on the advance of the gospel. His first question is not, why did God allow all these awful things to happen to me? Nor, what is God playing at? No, he was far more concerned about the impact of the gospel. He was totally single-minded. So let's unpick what's happening here. Paul informs us how his being in chains has served to advance the gospel. He presents us with two ways in which God has turned the negative of his chains and imprisonment into a positive, the advancing of the gospel. Firstly, in verse 13, as a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. We've already discovered how Paul was given the opportunity to talk about Jesus to the Sanhedrin, to the Roman commander, to the Roman courts, to the governors Felix and Festus, to King Agrippa and Bernice. Later, when he gets to Rome, he is placed in a rented house and chained to a Roman soldier. In fact, the soldiers were part of the elite Praetorian Guard, who were official bodyguards of the emperor. But it wasn't just one guard that Paul was chained to. The guard stayed on duty for 6 hours at a time, so Paul was chained for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for 2 years. I imagine that he met quite a few guards in that time. But can you imagine what it must have been like to be chained to the Apostle Paul for 6 hours at a time? An atheist's worst nightmare. A man who, by his own admission, prayed without ceasing. The sheer quality of his life, the friends who had visited, the conversations that he had, the prayers that he prayed, and the letters that he wrote must have had a phenomenal effect upon their outlook and lives. They must have been amazed at his ability to be joyful in the midst of great trials, because Paul didn't know whether he was going to live or die, and yet he overflowed with joy. To him, life was about Christ, and death was about being with Christ. I believe his life must have had such an effect upon these elite troops. I can only imagine that a number of them became Christians through Paul's influence. Paul says that it was clear to the palace guards that he was in chains for Christ. And then he comes out with this little phrase, and to everyone else. Well, who is this everyone else? The everyone else in Caesar's court. Paul was in Rome as an official prisoner, and his case was an important one. This was a test case. The Roman government was going to determine the official status of this Christian sect. Was Christianity an offshoot from the Jewish religion? Was it dangerous to national security? Was it some strange and weird religion that would destabilize the nation? Well, the best brains of Caesar's court were needed to seriously study Christian teaching before they could make a judgment. Paul must have had a chuckle to himself, knowing that many of the court officials had to study the doctrines of the Christian faith before they could try him. Well, if we were left to devise the best way for advancing the gospel, I can almost guarantee that it would not have included Paul being locked up for 2 years. We would argue that he was needed to be out and about, moving from city to city, an apostle to the Gentiles. And yet things that are on the outside that appear to be damaging and negative to us can be a part of God's great plan and purposes. In fact, that's so important. Let me just say that again. Things that on the outside appear to be damaging and negative to us can be a part of God's great plan and purposes. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. How puny we are, how little we understand the mind and the ways of God, whose foolishness is infinitely superior to our wisdom. And secondly, Paul had not finished. There was yet another way in which the gospel was being advanced. He tells us in verse 14, "And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear." Many of the believers saw what was happening to Paul, and instead of them being discouraged, it had the opposite effect. They were encouraged to speak the word of God more courageously and fearlessly. Notice there, Paul didn't wait until he was released from his chains to be useful to God. He made the most of the opportunity there and then. He spoke to the guards, he prayed, he wrote letters to others, which have become a part of the New Testament and changed the course of history. You might feel that you are chained by some set of circumstances, chained by illness, chained by young children, chained to the sink, chained to that job, or by that financial situation. And maybe you've said, when my circumstances change, and when I'm unchained, then I will be useful to God. But God says, now is the time. Serve God wherever you are. Christian history is filled with stories of people who, despite their chains, have been used amazingly by God. I'd like to encourage you to read biographies of people, often very ordinary people who have been used by God. I could keep you here another couple of hours in telling you stories about people like Susanna Wesley and Johnny Erickson Tada and Nick Vujicic and Fanny Crosby and so many others who would not allow their chains to define them. Maybe we'll do that on another occasion. But if you've not heard of these people, then I do encourage you to look them up. Let me leave you with 2 challenges. Challenge 1. Do not despise your chains. Do not despise that trial or difficulty, but ask the Lord, how might this advance the gospel? And Lord, what are you teaching me? And challenge 2. Today is God's day. Don't look to the future saying that you will serve God when you can be freed from your present circumstances. When I finished my exams, when the kids have grown up, when I've retired, when I get married, when. Today is the day to be used by God, and it's the only time that we can guarantee. In some of our recent Wednesday morning meetings, we have sung together a Philippa Hannah song, "You Still Reign and You Are Still God." Personally, I think it is one of the most beautiful, wonderful, powerful and most helpful songs I've heard for many years. And maybe you would like to join me now in using the words of Philippa's song as a prayer. Shall we pray together? when all foundations have been shaken, when I'm left standing in the dark, and all I feel is my heart breaking, you still reign, and you're still God. And when it feels all hope is faded, the heavy questions hit so hard, and though my soul may feel forsaken, you still reign, and you're still God. Though I can't see what's before me, I know that I can trust your heart, and this one truth will be my story. You still reign, and you're still God. I will declare that you are with me. The voices whisper that you're not. You'll never leave me nor forsake me, 'cause you still reign, and you're still God. And when my enemies surround me, I'll trust the victory of your cross. I'll fix my eyes upon you, Jesus, for you are God, and I am not. You are good, and you are faithful, as you have been from the start. You're working all things for your glory, 'cause you still reign, and you're still God. And though I can't see what's before me, I know I can trust your heart. And this one truth will be my story, that you still reign, and you're still God. Thank you so much for being with us today. Have a great week. God bless.